The first dawn of 1945 broke with silence. Mist curling across frozen airfields in Belgium and Holland. Allied pilots, still groggy from New Year's celebrations, thought the skies were theirs. Then, out of nowhere, hundreds of German fighters roared overhead in a desperate gamble to turn back the tide of war. Within hours, the Luftwaffe would lose nearly 300 aircraft and over 200 of its most seasoned pilots, the greatest single-day disaster in its history. But how did the world's most feared air force, once masters of the skies, collapse in such a spectacular fashion? This is not just a story of planes and battles, it's the story of ambition, desperation, and the moment when German air power destroyed itself. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss stories like this one. And I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. It's always incredible to see this global community come together to relive history's turning points. The first dawn of 1945 was bitterly cold across the airfields of Belgium, Holland, and northern France. Frost clung to the wings of Allied fighters lined neatly on muddy runways, their engines silent after a long New Year's Eve. Inside mess halls, American and British pilots rubbed sleep from their eyes, some nursing hangovers, others convinced that the war was already entering its final months. After all, the Luftwaffe had been a ghost for months, rarely daring to challenge Allied dominance in the skies. The mood was casual, almost careless. No one expected what was about to come. Then, just after 9 a.m., the stillness shattered. A low rumble grew into a roar, like distant thunder sweeping closer. Allied ground crews ran outside, confused at first, until dark silhouettes burst through the mist. Wave after wave of German fighters, Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, came tearing in at treetop level. Their wings flashed as cannons opened fire, shredding parked aircraft in a storm of metal and flame. For the first time in years, the Luftwaffe wasn't hiding. It had returned in force, and the shock was immediate. At Eindhoven, Brussels, and dozens of other bases, chaos erupted. Mechanics dove for cover as fuel trucks exploded, sending fireballs into the morning sky. Pilots sprinted to their cockpits, desperately trying to get airborne before their planes were reduced to burning wrecks. For a few terrifying minutes, the Germans seemed unstoppable. They had achieved complete surprise. Allied airfields, once thought secure behind advancing front lines, were suddenly battlegrounds. It was as if the ghost of 1940 had returned, with German fighters ruling the skies once again. But hidden beneath the spectacle was a fatal flaw. Many of the German pilots were barely out of flight school, trained for air-to-air combat but inexperienced in ground attack. Instead of methodically strafing rows of aircraft, they wasted ammunition on buildings, vehicles, even empty hangars. Their attacks looked dramatic, but left critical assets untouched. And while they focused on the ground, Allied radar screens lit up. Controllers quickly vectored reinforcements, sending squadrons scrambling from nearby fields. The element of surprise was already slipping away. Within minutes, the tide began to turn. British Tempests and American Mustangs clawed into the sky, finding German raiders flying dangerously low and distracted. The tables flipped almost instantly. Allied pilots, many veterans of years of dogfights, pounced from above. For them, it was like shooting fish in a barrel. German formations broke apart under the sudden counterattack. The hunters had become the hunted, their brief advantage dissolving into disaster. What had begun as a bold strike was unraveling before their eyes. By the time the morning haze lifted, the picture was clear. The Luftwaffe had staked everything on this desperate gamble, and it was already bleeding to death. Dozens of its fighters lay scattered in smoking craters, many brought down not by the Allies, but by their own anti-aircraft gunners who had fired on them in confusion during takeoff. The dream of crippling Allied air power in one decisive strike was slipping away with every passing minute. And yet, as the smoke drifted across ruined airfields, Few realized they were witnessing the Luftwaffe's last breath, the morning that marked the beginning of its end. To understand why the shock of January 1st, 1945 was so profound, we need to look back to the days when the Luftwaffe wasn't a shadow, but a giant. In 1939, as Hitler unleashed his war machine on Poland, the German Air Force was unmatched. Its pilots had already honed their skills in Spain during the Civil War, flying combat missions that gave them real battlefield experience before the Second World War even began. The world had taken note. Here was an Air Force that didn't just promise dominance, it demonstrated it with terrifying efficiency. The aircraft themselves were engineering marvels of their time. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, sleek and fast, was the backbone of Germany's fighter force. The twin-engine Junkers Ju-88 could serve as a bomber, a night fighter, or a reconnaissance plane. The Stuka dive bomber, with its infamous screaming sirens, became a psychological weapon as much as a military tool. These machines, combined with aggressive tactics and experienced pilots, formed the aerial fist that made blitzkrieg possible. When German tanks rolled into Poland, it was the Luftwaffe that first cleared the skies, blasting away resistance and softening targets on the ground. From Poland to France, their dominance seemed unstoppable. In the spring of 1940, German aircraft decimated the French Air Force in a matter of weeks. Pilots flew with supreme confidence, believing they were rewriting the future of modern warfare. In the early months, it often felt as if the Luftwaffe could be anywhere, anytime, striking cities, columns, and strongholds before defenders even realized they were under attack. Germany's enemies were stunned by the speed and coordination of this new style of warfare. Even Britain, the empire that had stood tall for centuries, felt the weight of this force during the Battle of Britain. The summer skies of 1940 saw waves of German fighters and bombers sweeping over the English Channel, intent on smashing the Royal Air Force into submission. For a moment, it seemed that they might succeed. Pilots like Hans-Joachim Marseille and Erich Hartmann became household names in Germany, scoring dozens, even hundreds of victories in the air. Their reputations turned them into national heroes, symbols of an invincibility that ordinary Germans clung to as proof of their nation's superiority. But beneath the triumph was a hidden danger. The very success of the Luftwaffe encouraged overconfidence. Every victory fed the belief that air power alone could secure German domination. Yet wars, like storms, shift direction when least expected. While German pilots were racking up impressive numbers in the West, the seeds of eventual collapse were already being sown in the East. New enemies with vast resources were on the horizon, and the Luftwaffe was about to be stretched far beyond what even its skilled aviators could endure. Still, in those early years, the Luftwaffe stood at its peak, a formidable, almost mythic force that terrified opponents and thrilled its own nation. The sight of German fighters roaring overhead struck both awe and dread. And that makes the events of 1945 all the more staggering. How could such a powerful air force, once feared across continents, end up destroying itself in a single morning? To answer that, we must follow the tide as it began to turn against Germany in the skies. By 1942, the aura of invincibility that had surrounded the Luftwaffe was beginning to crack. For the first time since the war began, German pilots were no longer fighting from a position of overwhelming strength. Instead, they were being forced into battles of attrition, battles that no amount of individual skill could win. The skies were no longer theirs alone, and every month that passed chipped away at both their numbers and their confidence. On the Eastern Front, the Luftwaffe faced an enemy with seemingly endless manpower and determination. Soviet aircraft, once dismissed as inferior, began to appear in swarms. The rugged Yakovlev fighters and Ilyushin ground attack planes might not have been as refined as German designs, but they were durable, numerous, and flown by pilots who were learning quickly. Every German loss hurt, while every Soviet loss was swiftly replaced. The balance that had once favored Germany was tilting, and the Luftwaffe was bleeding out in a war of exhaustion. At the same time, the Western Allies brought a new dimension to the fight. From 1943 onward, American bombers appeared in the skies over German cities in relentless waves. Heavily armed B-17s and B-24s rumbled across the horizon, their formations stretching for miles, escorted by long-range fighters like the P-51 Mustang. For the Luftwaffe, intercepting them was like throwing stones at a tidal wave. Each mission cost Germany irreplaceable pilots and aircraft, while American factories churned out replacements faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. The cruel mathematics of war became impossible to ignore. A seasoned German ace shot down over friendly territory might parachute to safety and fight again. But over enemy lines, he was lost forever, killed or captured. Meanwhile, the Allies trained thousands of new pilots in the safety of North America and Britain, far from the front lines. German replacements, by contrast, were barely trained boys, rushed into combat with only a handful of flying hours. As veterans fell, these novices filled the ranks, creating a force that looked formidable on paper, but was dangerously hollow in reality. By the summer of 1944, the situation had become catastrophic. D-Day had opened another front, and Allied fighters now operated from bases in France and Belgium, close to German territory. They hunted in packs, striking German aircraft the moment they lifted off the runway. The Luftwaffe had been reduced to defensive hit-and-run tactics, unable to mount large-scale operations without crippling losses. German commanders, once confident of ruling the skies, now admitted privately that they were bleeding to death in the air. The war in the skies was slipping beyond their grasp. This is the backdrop against which Operation Bodenplatte was conceived. The Luftwaffe, once feared as the sharp spear of blitzkrieg, was now desperate, battered, and gasping for relevance. Every pilot lost was a blow that could never be recovered. Every aircraft destroyed represented months of scarce resources gone forever. And yet Hermann Göring and his commanders still dreamed of one last strike, one bold move that could turn back the clock. But could desperation ever replace the strength they had already squandered? By late 1944, the Reich was reeling. On the ground, the German army was retreating on both fronts, battered by Soviet offensives in the east and the relentless push of American, British, and Canadian troops in the west. In the skies, the Luftwaffe, once Hitler's pride, was a shadow of its former self. And yet, in the corridors of power, Hermann Göring clung to a dangerous illusion that one bold, decisive blow could still turn the war around. Out of this desperation was born the plan that would become Operation Bodenplatte. The spark came from the Ardennes Offensive, better known as the Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, Hitler hurled his remaining reserves into the snowy forests of Belgium, hoping to split Allied armies and seize the port of Antwerp. For a brief moment, German tanks punched deep into enemy lines, catching the Allies off guard. But as soon as the weather cleared, Allied fighter bombers swarmed the skies, turning German columns into burning wrecks. Commanders on the ground pleaded for air cover, but the Luftwaffe could do little more than harass enemy aircraft. Without control of the skies, the offensive was doomed. This crisis handed Göring an opportunity. If the Luftwaffe could somehow cripple Allied air power in one massive surprise attack, the German army might still have a chance. Destroy hundreds of aircraft on the ground, and the skies over Belgium and Holland would fall silent, even if only for a few days. Göring promised Hitler that the operation could swing the momentum, restore German prestige, and perhaps even prolong the war. For a dictator increasingly delusional and desperate for miracles, the idea sounded like salvation. The plan itself was deceptively simple. On New Year's morning, when Allied pilots were likely to be off guard, more than 1,000 German fighters would strike Allied airfields across Belgium, Holland, and northern France. The code name was Bodenplatte, baseplate, though Göring preferred to dress it up with dramatic flair. The goal was nothing less than the elimination of Allied tactical air power in one fell swoop. Catch the planes on the ground, burn them before they could take off, and the Allies would be left blind and vulnerable. But beneath the grand vision lurked brutal realities. Germany's fuel supplies were critically low. Aircraft were in short supply, patched together from scarce parts. And, most crucially, the Luftwaffe no longer had the pilots to carry out such a mission. The veterans who had once dominated the skies were gone, dead or captured. In their place were teenagers, some with barely 50 hours of flying time, about to be asked to execute one of the most complex operations of the entire war. Even seasoned commanders questioned whether the risk outweighed the potential gain. Still, orders were orders. Plans were drawn, targets selected, and secrecy became paramount. Even German anti-aircraft units were not told of the mission, a decision that would prove disastrous. As New Year's Eve approached, fuel trucks rumbled toward forward bases. Mechanics patched up long-grounded fighters, and nervous pilots scribbled notes in diaries, knowing they might not live to see 1945's first sunset. The Reich was gambling what little remained of its strength on a single throw of the dice. What no one could predict was just how catastrophically that gamble would fail. As the plan for Operation Bodenplatte took shape, one reality became impossible to ignore. The Luftwaffe no longer had the seasoned warriors who had once made it the terror of Europe. By the end of 1944, most of the legendary aces were gone, killed in combat, captured behind enemy lines, or transferred to desk jobs. What remained was a fragile mix of exhausted veterans and wide-eyed teenagers barely trained for war. Yet these would be the men tasked with carrying out the largest coordinated air assault since the early years of the conflict. The shortage of skilled pilots was alarming. Many of the young flyers sent to the front had logged fewer than 50 flight hours, far less than Allied trainees who often had hundreds before ever facing combat. These German boys were rushed through flight school, sometimes skipping advanced training entirely before being thrown into cockpits of complex machines like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf 190. Some could barely handle the aircraft's quirks, let alone navigate through winter mist, avoid radar, and execute precision strikes on heavily defended airfields. Fuel shortages compounded the crisis. Germany's synthetic fuel plants had been hammered by Allied bombing campaigns, and reserves were running dangerously low. Every leader had to be rationed, forcing commanders to choose between training exercises and saving enough fuel for the operation itself. As a result, many young pilots entered battle with little more than classroom knowledge and blind faith in their instructors' words. They would be learning in real time, against some of the best-trained airmen in the world. The aircraft themselves told another story of desperation. Some planes were pulled from training units, others scavenged from maintenance depots, patched together with whatever spare parts could be found. Mechanics worked around the clock, often cannibalizing wrecked aircraft to keep others flight-worthy. On paper, more than 1,000 fighters were assembled for the mission, but many were barely airworthy. Engines leaked, weapons jammed, radios malfunctioned. It was an armada built less on strength than on hope. Yet, despite all these obstacles, the men prepared with grim determination. In briefing rooms across Western Germany, pilots studied aerial photographs of Allied airfields, memorizing the layouts of runways, hangars, and fuel dumps they would attack at dawn. Some scribbled last notes to families, others joked nervously to mask their fear. For the youngest, the mission was framed as a chance for glory, a decisive strike that might restore Germany's honor. For the veterans, it was just another suicide order dressed up as strategy. By the final days of December, the stage was set. Fuel trucks had filled tanks to their limits, ammunition belts were loaded, and flight crews checked and rechecked machines that might not return. The night before the attack, one 19-year-old pilot wrote in his diary, "Tomorrow we strike a blow that will change the war. I pray I have the courage to do my duty and the skill to survive. For many, it would be their last entry. The Luftwaffe had gathered its last eagles, but they were eagles with clipped wings, flying into a storm they could not possibly control. New Year's morning, 1945. Across Western Germany, engines roared to life in the freezing pre-dawn dark. Mechanics waved pilots forward as one by one, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs taxied down icy runways, their navigation lights flickering in the gloom. The plan demanded perfect timing. Hundreds of fighters had to rise together, form up in formation, and streak west at low altitude to surprise the Allies. To the ground crews watching, it was a breathtaking sight, the largest Luftwaffe deployment in years. Yet hidden in the beauty of that spectacle were seeds of catastrophe already taking root. The first disaster came almost immediately. To preserve secrecy, German commanders had never informed their own anti-aircraft units of the mission. As waves of fighters skimmed treetops, nervous flak gunners spotted silhouettes against the morning sky and opened fire. Shells tore through friendly formations. Within minutes, German aircraft were falling in flames, destroyed not by the Allies, but by their own defenses. Pilots who had trained for weeks died before even crossing the front lines, victims of a tragic miscalculation. For those who survived the gauntlet of friendly fire, another challenge loomed: navigation. Flying at treetop level to avoid radar, inexperienced pilots struggled to hold formation in the mist. Many had never flown such long distances or operated over unfamiliar territory. Some strayed off course, others lagged behind. Carefully synchronized strike waves began to unravel into scattered, isolated groups. The precision needed for success was already breaking down, even before the first target came into view. Meanwhile, the weather itself became an enemy. Winter haze hung low over the Ardennes, obscuring landmarks that were supposed to guide the formations. Pilots relied on sketchy maps and memory of aerial photos, but small errors multiplied quickly. Squadrons intended for Brussels ended up over empty fields. Others arrived too early or too late, shattering the coordinated timing meant to overwhelm Allied defenses. What had been conceived as a hammer blow was splintering into piecemeal raids. Yet despite confusion and mounting losses, the German pilots pressed on. Some were driven by duty, others by desperation, and many by youthful bravado. They skimmed over forests and villages at breakneck speed, engines screaming just above rooftops, hoping surprise would outweigh inexperience. The Allied front lines were just ahead, and with them, the airfields that represented both the promise of victory and the risk of annihilation. By 9:20 a.m., the first formations broke through the morning mist, Allied runways appearing suddenly below them. For a fleeting moment, the plan seemed to be working. Rows of aircraft sat parked, defenseless, as German fighters dived in low. Cannon fire erupted, fuel trucks exploded, and Allied ground crews scattered. But the cracks in the operation were already too deep. Within minutes, the attack that had begun with thunder and fire would spiral into chaos, and the hunters would discover they were not the only predators in the sky. When the first German formations reached Allied airfields, the attack looked devastating. At Eindhoven, Focke-Wulf 190s swept in from the rising sun, their cannons ripping through parked typhoons and tempests. Explosions rocked fuel depots, black smoke billowed skyward, and mechanics scrambled for cover as hangars collapsed in flames. For a few breathless minutes, it seemed the Luftwaffe had rediscovered its old ferocity. Pilots who had grown used to Allied dominance suddenly watched chaos unfold right outside their barracks windows. At Brussels, American units awoke to a nightmare. P-47, Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, lined neatly on the tarmac, were torn apart before their pilots could reach them. Ground crews leapt into slit trenches as cannon shells stitched across runways. In the confusion, some Germans managed multiple strafing runs, turning Allied airfields into firestorms. The initial shock was undeniable. After years of retreat, the Luftwaffe had returned with fire and fury, and for a fleeting instant, the gamble looked like it might succeed. But the cracks appeared quickly. Many German pilots, trained for dogfights rather than ground attacks, wasted ammunition on soft targets. Trucks, empty buildings, even derelict aircraft left as decoys. Others flew sloppily, failing to coordinate their runs or circling too long in hostile skies. This left them vulnerable the moment Allied pilots scrambled into action. Within minutes, surviving Mustangs and Spitfires roared into the air. They found German raiders flying low, fixated on the ground, and oblivious to threats above. The reversal was brutal. At Brussels Evere, RAF ace Johnny Johnson described it as like shooting fish in a barrel. From higher altitude, Allied fighters pounced, cutting through German formations before they could climb. Across Holland and Belgium, the story repeated. Canadian Typhoons at St. Truden, Polish Spitfires at Opphoven, American Mustangs at Melbrock, all scrambled and struck back with lethal precision. What had begun as a surprise attack was dissolving into a massacre. Even worse, many German squadrons discovered their intelligence was outdated. Some airfields, thought to be packed with Allied planes, were nearly empty, recently relocated or dispersed to secondary strips. In places like Maldegem, German pilots wasted precious minutes strafing abandoned aircraft while Allied reinforcements swooped in. What was supposed to be a coordinated knockout blow had become a series of isolated raids, each vulnerable to rapid counterattack. By late morning, the skies over Belgium and Holland were filled not with victorious Luftwaffe squadrons, but with shattered formations fighting for survival. Columns of smoke rose from both Allied and German wrecks, but the imbalance was clear. For every Allied aircraft destroyed on the ground, several German fighters were being hunted down in the air. The shock that began the day had given way to grim reality. Operation Bodenplatte was slipping from daring gamble to disastrous blunder, and the blood price was only beginning to be counted. What the Germans had counted on, surprise, lasted only minutes. Once Allied controllers realized what was happening, the advantage swung sharply. Radar stations lit up with low-flying aircraft signatures, and messages flashed across radio networks, enemy raiders inbound. Within moments, Allied squadrons already in the air were vectored toward the attackers, while pilots on the ground scrambled into cockpits with a speed honed by years of experience. The Luftwaffe's thunderous entrance was about to meet an equally thunderous reply. At Brussels, Johnny Johnson and his wingmen dove from altitude straight onto German fighters still fixated on strafing runs. It was like ambushing men with their backs turned, he later recalled. In seconds, 3 Focke-Wulfs were ablaze, their wrecks littering the countryside. Similar scenes unfolded across Belgium and Holland. At Opphoven, Polish Spitfire pilots, many of whom had fled their occupied homeland, tore into German formations with merciless precision. For them, this was not just another battle, it was personal vengeance. The Germans had no room to maneuver. Flying low to avoid radar, they had trapped themselves between Allied fighters above and anti-aircraft guns below. Every attempt to climb was punished by swarms of Mustangs and Thunderbolts. Every attempt to stay low risked a curtain of ground fire. Inexperienced pilots panicked, breaking formation, wasting ammunition, or fleeing blindly into enemy territory. What had begun as a strike against Allied strength was becoming a disorganized retreat under fire. Some of the most devastating encounters came on the return journey. Allied radar tracked the scattered formations, and patrols of Mustangs were dispatched to intercept. Exhausted German pilots, low on fuel and ammunition, found themselves ambushed before they could even reach the safety of the Rhine. Entire squadrons were cut to ribbons in these running battles. The Luftwaffe's losses mounted not just from daring raids gone wrong, but from the relentless Allied ability to pursue and finish the job. Perhaps the cruelest twist was that many of the heaviest losses achieved nothing. At airfields like Maldegem, German pilots strafed decoys, derelict planes, or nearly empty bases. While they destroyed fuel trucks and burned hangars, the actual damage to Allied operational strength was minimal. By contrast, every German fighter shot down represented not just a machine, but months of scarce fuel, parts, and training invested, resources Germany no longer had. The arithmetic of attrition was turning the Luftwaffe's gamble into a self-inflicted wound. By midday, the roles were unmistakably reversed. The hunters had indeed become the hunted. Luftwaffe squadrons that had taken off in proud waves returned in fragments, if they returned at all. Pilots who had dreamed of glory limped home in smoking wrecks or never came back at all. And those who did survive carried with them the realization that the skies of Europe now belonged fully, irrevocably, to the Allies. Bodenplatte had not revived German air power. It had buried it. By the afternoon of January 1, 1945, the full scale of the disaster was undeniable. Across Belgium, Holland, and northern France, the wreckage of German fighters smoldered in fields, villages, and forests. Out of the roughly 1,000 aircraft that had taken off that morning, fewer than 650 returned. Nearly 300 were destroyed or damaged beyond repair, an entire wing's worth of fighters wiped out in a single day. Even worse, more than 230 of Germany's most experienced pilots were killed, wounded, or captured. For an air force already on life support, it was a death sentence. The Luftwaffe's gamble had been built on a cruel arithmetic, that destroying hundreds of Allied planes on the ground would outweigh any losses in the air. But the exchange was catastrophic. Yes, roughly 180 Allied aircraft were damaged or destroyed, but most were quickly replaced from American and British factories, churning out machines faster than the Luftwaffe could ever dream of. Allied pilot casualties were minimal, just over 30 airmen. By contrast, the Luftwaffe had lost men it could never replace, veterans whose skills were priceless. In raw numbers, the Allies lost machines. Germany lost its soul in the skies. Inside Luftwaffe command posts, silence replaced bravado. Reports flooded in of squadrons reduced to ashes, of formations that had vanished entirely. General Adolf Galland, the fighter commander, put it bluntly, "We have just committed suicide." His words captured the reality that even Allied bombs had failed to achieve. Operation Bodenplatte had finished the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force. The air force that once symbolized German might had destroyed itself, not in a drawn-out campaign, but in a single morning. The human stories were just as devastating. Young men barely out of their teens never returned from their first true mission. Veterans who had survived hundreds of sorties were cut down in minutes, outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Some, like 19-year-old Fritz Kraft, left behind diary entries filled with hope and determination, only to vanish in smoke and wreckage. Others returned alive but broken, carrying scars, physical and psychological, that would haunt them long after the war. For the Luftwaffe, the tragedy was not just in numbers, but in wasted courage. Back home in Germany, the disaster sent shockwaves through the armed forces and the civilian population. Soldiers on the Eastern Front realized they would never again see German fighters swoop in to support them. Anti-aircraft crews defending cities understood they now stood alone against the Allied bombing campaigns. Ordinary citizens, once proud of their daring eagles, whispered that the Luftwaffe was finished. Even Hitler, who once boasted of his air force, fell silent. He never again publicly praised the Luftwaffe. It had become an embarrassment rather than a symbol of power. In truth, January 1st marked more than just a failed operation. It marked the funeral of German air power. From that day forward, Allied aircraft roamed over Germany with near impunity, bombing cities, railways, and factories without serious resistance. Operation Bodenplatte had been conceived as a bold stroke to revive the Reich's fortunes. Instead, it sealed the Luftwaffe's fate. What bombs and attrition had chipped away for years, desperation finished in hours. The day the Luftwaffe died was not written in slow decline, but in the flames of one reckless morning. Operation Bodenplatte was meant to be the Luftwaffe's redemption. Instead, it became its obituary. The plan had been bold, perhaps even brilliant in concept, but its execution revealed the rot at the heart of the German war machine. Poor intelligence, inexperienced pilots, inadequate fuel, and sheer desperation turned what might have been a tactical blow into a strategic catastrophe. By concentrating all remaining strength into one gamble, Germany ensured that its failure would be total and irreversible. In the days that followed, Allied forces quickly realized just how badly the Luftwaffe had been broken. Radar stations reported dwindling interceptions. Bombers that once faced fierce resistance now flew missions with near impunity. Fighter pilots remarked that the skies seemed emptier, the enemy scarcer. What Bodenplatte had accomplished more than anything was to erase the last illusion that Germany could contest the air. From January 1945 onward, the Allies controlled not just the ground war, but the heavens above it. For the German High Command, the operation carried bitter lessons. Göring, desperate to preserve his own standing with Hitler, had promised victory but delivered ruin. Pilots had been thrown into an impossible mission, not because it made sense militarily, but because political survival demanded it. Even loyal commanders admitted privately that the Air Force had been sacrificed for little more than appearances. In that sense, Bodenplatte revealed a deeper truth. By 1945, the Nazi leadership was no longer fighting to win the war. It was fighting to delay the inevitable, whatever the cost in blood. The legacy also extended to the men who fought it. Survivors carried guilt and grief for decades, recalling comrades lost in burning cockpits and crashes across Belgium and Holland. Many admitted they had known, even as they took off that morning, that the mission was doomed. Their courage had been undeniable, but courage cannot compensate for poor leadership and impossible odds. To this day, memorials dot the countryside where German aircraft fell, maintained by local communities who honor the young men, many still teenagers, who died far from home in service of a cause history judged unforgivably wrong. For the Allies, Bodenplatte became a story of both alarm and reassurance. Alarm because the Germans had shown they could still strike with force and coordination when least expected. Reassurance because the outcome proved that even Germany's best efforts could no longer reverse the tide. If this was the Luftwaffe's last great gamble, then the Allies had nothing left to fear in the skies. British ace Johnny Johnson summed it up best. "They threw everything they had at us, and we smashed them to pieces. The sky belongs to us now." And so the story of Operation Bodenplatte closes not as a tale of triumph, but as a cautionary reminder. Wars are not won by last-minute gambles or desperate illusions. They are won by strategy, resources, and leadership that recognizes reality rather than denying it. On New Year's Day 1945, the Luftwaffe tried to rewrite the ending of the war in one furious stroke. Instead, it wrote its own final chapter, a chapter of wasted bravery, shattered illusions, and the death of German air power.